Martha Henderson clutched her 5-year-old son Tommy closer to her chest as the wagon wheels hit another deep rut in the rough prairie trail. The wooden seat beneath them creaked and groaned with every bump, and dust clouds swirled around them in the hot August sun of 1876. She had been traveling for 3 weeks now, heading west toward the Montana Territory where her late husband's brother had promised them a new start. The journey had been harder than she ever imagined. When cholera took her husband James 6 months ago back in Missouri, Martha thought her world had ended. James had been everything to her, provider, protector, and the love of her life. Now she was alone with Tommy, carrying nothing but a few belongings in their covered wagon and the last of their savings sewn into the hem of her dress. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Tommy whispered, his small voice barely audible over the constant creaking of the wagon and the clip-clop of their aging horse. "Bessie." Martha reached for the water canteen hanging from a hook beside her. Only a few drops remained. She had been rationing their water carefully, but they had miscalculated the distance between water sources. The map James's brother had sent showed a creek about 5 miles ahead, but that was still hours away at their slow pace. "Just a tiny sip, sweetheart," she said, tilting the canteen to his lips. "We'll find more water soon." Tommy nodded without complaint. He had grown up so much in the past few months, becoming her little man when she needed him most. His bright blue eyes, so much like his father's, looked up at her with complete trust. That trust both warmed her heart and terrified her. What if she couldn't keep him safe? What if she had made a terrible mistake leaving everything familiar behind? The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of tall grass that swayed in the warm breeze. Occasionally, she spotted small herds of antelope in the distance, their white rumps flashing as they bounded away from the approaching wagon. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents in lazy spirals. It was beautiful in its vast loneliness, but also frightening. Out here, they were completely on their own. As the afternoon wore on, Martha noticed that Bessie was slowing down even more than usual. The old mare's head hung low, and she was breathing heavily. Martha climbed down from the wagon seat to check on her. Bessie's coat was covered in sweat, and her eyes looked dull and tired. "Oh, Bessie girl," Martha murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "You're as thirsty as we are, aren't you?" She looked around at the endless prairie. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the grass tips gold. They needed to reach that creek before nightfall, but Bessie might not make it that far without rest and water. Martha made a difficult decision. She unhitched Bessie from the wagon and led her to a small patch of shade beside a cluster of rocks. From their meager supplies, she poured some of their remaining water into her cupped hands and let Bessie drink. It was water they could barely spare, but the horse had carried them faithfully for hundreds of miles. Without Bessie, they would be stranded completely. "Are we stopping here for the night, Mama?" Tommy asked, climbing down from the wagon. Martha looked at the darkening sky. Storm clouds were building on the western horizon, dark and threatening. "I don't think so. Sweetheart, see those clouds? We need to find better shelter than this." As if summoned by her words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the prairie. The storm was still far away, but it was definitely heading their direction. Martha felt a chill of fear. Being caught in a prairie thunderstorm in the open was dangerous enough, but if it brought hail or tornadoes, they could be in serious trouble. After letting Bessie rest for 30 minutes, Martha hitched her up again and they resumed their slow journey toward the creek. The storm clouds continued to build, towering higher into the sky like dark mountains. Lightning flickered within them, still too far away to hear the thunder. As they crested a small hill, Martha's heart leaped with relief. There, in the valley below, she could see the dark line of trees that marked the creek, water, shade, and shelter from the approaching storm. She urged Bessie forward with renewed hope, but as they descended toward the creek, something made Martha pause. In the distance, she could see what looked like a dark patch moving across the prairie. At first, she thought it might be a shadow from the storm clouds, but the shadow was moving against the wind direction. She shaded her eyes with her hand and squinted into the setting sun. The dark patch was getting larger, and now she could make out individual shapes within it. Her blood turned to ice as she realized what she was seeing. Buffalo. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, moving in a massive herd across the prairie, and they were heading directly toward the creek. Martha had heard stories about buffalo herds from other travelers. When they moved, nothing could stop them. They would trample anything in their path, Wagons, horses, people. The story spoke of herds so vast they took hours to pass, like a brown river of muscle and horn flowing across the landscape. "Tommy, get in the back of the wagon and stay low," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "What's wrong, Mama?" "Just do as I say, sweetheart, right now." Tommy must have heard something in her tone because he immediately scrambled into the covered portion of the wagon without another word. Martha whipped the reins, urging Bessie to move faster toward the trees by the creek. If they could reach the shelter of the creek bed before the herd arrived, they might be able to hide until it passed. But Bessie, already exhausted and dehydrated, could only manage a tired trot. The buffalo herd was moving much faster, and Martha could now hear the low rumble of thousands of hooves pounding the earth. It sounded like distant thunder, but this thunder was getting louder by the minute. As they reached the edge of the creek valley, Martha could see individual buffalo clearly. They were massive creatures, their shaggy brown heads lowered as they ran. The lead animals were already reaching the far side of the creek, only a few hundred yards away. Martha made a desperate decision. She steered Bessie down the steep bank toward the creek itself, hoping the water might provide some protection. The wagon tilted dangerously as they descended, and she heard Tommy yelp in fear from the back. They reached the creek bottom just as the first buffalo crashed through the trees on the opposite bank. The water was only knee-deep, but it was flowing and clear, the first good water they had seen in days. Under normal circumstances, Martha would have been overjoyed. Now, she was focused entirely on survival. She unhitched Bessie as quickly as her shaking hands would allow, and led the horse into the water. The creek bed was about 20 feet wide, with steep banks on both sides. If they stayed in the water, maybe the buffalo would pass over them without noticing. "Tommy, come here quickly," she called. Her son emerged from the wagon, his eyes wide with fear as the thundering sound grew louder. Martha grabbed him and waded into the center of the creek, leading Bessie with her other hand. The first buffalo appeared at the top of the bank directly above them. It was a massive bull, its dark eyes wild with the frenzy of the stampede. For a terrifying moment, it seemed to look directly down at them. Then more buffalo crowded behind it, and the pressure of the herd pushed it forward. The bull leaped down into the creek valley, landing heavily just 10 feet from where Martha and Tommy stood in the water. Its hooves threw up great clods of mud as it scrambled up the opposite bank. More buffalo followed, creating a living waterfall of brown fur and sharp horns. Martha pulled Tommy against her and covered his head with her arms as buffalo began jumping over them on both sides. The noise was deafening, the pounding of hooves, the grunting and snorting of the massive animals, the splash of water as some landed in the creek itself. Bessie reared in terror, nearly pulling free from Martha's grip. A young buffalo cow, trying to avoid the horse, stumbled and fell sideways into the water with a tremendous splash. Martha felt the spray hit her face as the animal thrashed frantically to regain its footing. The cow's wild movements spooked more buffalo on the bank above. Instead of jumping cleanly over the creek, they began sliding down the steep sides, creating a chaotic tangle of animals in the narrow valley. Martha found herself surrounded by massive, panic-stricken beasts, each one weighing over 1,000 pounds and capable of crushing her and Tommy without even noticing. One bull, larger than the rest, slid down the bank and landed directly in front of them. Its massive head swung toward Martha, and she could see the confusion and fear in its dark eyes. The animal was trapped between the steep banks, just like they were. But unlike them, it had the power to fight its way out. The bull lowered its head and charged toward the opposite bank, passing so close to Martha that she could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. Its shoulder brushed against Bessie, sending the horse stumbling backward into deeper water. More buffalo were sliding into the creek now, creating a bottleneck as the animals struggled to climb the muddy banks. The water around Martha and Tommy was churning with mud and foam. The air was filled with dust and the acrid smell of the herd. Through the chaos, Martha heard a new sound that made her heart stop. Tommy was crying, not just from fear, but from pain. She looked down and saw blood on his arm where a buffalo's hoof had grazed him as it passed. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though she wasn't sure he could hear her over the thunderous noise. "We're going to be okay." But even as she said the words, Martha could see that their situation was becoming more desperate by the moment. The creek valley was filling with confused, frightened buffalo that couldn't find their way out. More animals kept sliding down from above, adding to the chaos. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a widow and her small son stood in the muddy water, holding on to a terrified horse and praying for a miracle. The storm clouds overhead opened up, adding cold rain to their misery. Lightning flashed, followed by booming thunder that spooked the buffalo even more. Martha looked up at the dark sky and wondered if this was how her story would end. Not slowly from disease or hardship, but quickly, trampled by a force of nature that neither knew nor cared about her hopes and dreams. But even in that moment of despair, she didn't give up. She held Tommy tighter and whispered every prayer she could remember, hoping that somehow, someone or something would help them survive this nightmare on the prairie. The rain fell harder now, turning the creek bottom into a slippery mud pit. Martha's dress clung to her legs as she struggled to keep her footing in the churning water. Buffalo continued to pour into the narrow valley, their massive bodies creating a wall of brown fur and sharp horns around her and Tommy. The sound was overwhelming. Thousands of hooves thundering overhead, the splash and grunt of animals in the water, and the crack of lightning from the storm above. Through the chaos, Martha caught glimpses of the prairie above them. The herd seemed endless, a dark river flowing across the grassland as far as she could see. She had never imagined so many buffalo existed in the entire world, let alone moving together in one massive group. A young calf, separated from its mother in the confusion, bleated pitifully as it struggled against the muddy bank. Its cries were answered by the desperate bellowing of a cow somewhere in the tangle of animals above. The mother's frantic attempts to reach her baby were causing even more chaos as she pushed against the flow of the herd. Martha felt a moment of sympathy for the buffalo cow, a mother trying to protect her child just as she was, but that sympathy vanished quickly as more animals slid down the bank, their hooves sending showers of mud and stones into the water where she and Tommy stood. Bessie was becoming more panicked by the minute. The old mare's eyes rolled white with terror, and she kept trying to bolt toward the bank, only to rear back when she saw the wall of buffalo blocking her escape. Martha's arms ached from holding the horse's lead rope while also keeping Tommy pressed against her side. The rain was coming down in sheets now, making it even harder to see. Martha wiped her eyes and looked up through the downpour, desperately searching for any sign that the herd might be thinning. But all she could see were more buffalo, their dark shapes moving against the stormy sky like a living nightmare. Suddenly, a massive bull slid down the bank directly toward them. Unlike the others, this one didn't try to scramble back up immediately. Instead, it stood in the water, shaking its great shaggy head and looking around with intelligent, calculating eyes. Martha's blood froze as she realized this buffalo was different from the rest. It wasn't panicked or confused. It was angry. The bull had a distinctive white patch on its forehead and scars across its massive shoulders, signs of many battles with other bulls for dominance of the herd. This was clearly an old leader, and he didn't appreciate being trapped in the muddy creek any more than they did. The bull's gaze fixed on Bessie, and Martha could see the challenge in its eyes. To the buffalo, the horse was an intruder in his territory. The bull snorted loudly and lowered its massive head, its curved horns pointing directly at them. Martha's mind raced. She couldn't outrun a charging buffalo, especially while holding Tommy and trying to control Bessie. The creek banks were too steep and muddy to climb quickly. There was nowhere to go. The bull took a step forward, its hooves splashing in the shallow water. Martha could see the muscles bunching in its powerful shoulders as it prepared to charge. She closed her eyes and pulled Tommy as close as she could, whispering one last prayer. But the charge never came. Instead, Martha heard something that seemed impossible in the midst of the chaos. A human voice, strong and clear, cutting through the noise of the stampede. She opened her eyes to see a figure on the bank above them, silhouetted against the stormy sky. It was a man, but unlike any man she had ever seen. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin pants and a fringed shirt that seemed to be made from buffalo hide. His long black hair whipped in the wind, and even from a distance, Martha could see that his skin was deeply tanned from years under the prairie sun. But what struck her most was his complete lack of fear as he stood calmly among the stampeding buffalo. The man raised his arms and let out a sound that was part whistle, part call, and completely unlike anything Martha had ever heard. It was the sound of someone who belonged in this wild place, someone who understood the language of the beasts around him. The effect was immediate and startling. The angry bull in the creek stopped its advance and turned toward the sound. The man called again, a different note this time, and several buffalo on the bank above actually moved aside to let him pass. Martha watched in amazement as the man worked his way down the steep bank, moving with the sure-footed grace of someone who had spent his entire life in rough country. Buffalo that had been wild with panic seemed to calm at his presence. It was as if he carried some invisible authority that even the massive beasts recognized. As he got closer, Martha could see more details. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with weathered features that spoke of a hard life lived outdoors. His eyes were a startling pale blue, unusual in someone with such dark skin and hair. Those eyes held a mixture of Native American and European features that suggested he was of mixed heritage, a man caught between two worlds. Around his neck hung a necklace made from what looked like buffalo teeth and eagle feathers. His belt held a long knife and what appeared to be a tomahawk. This was clearly someone who lived by his wits and his weapons in the untamed wilderness. The man reached the creek bottom and stood between Martha's family and the threatening bull. He didn't carry any visible weapon, but his presence alone seemed to change the entire dynamic in the narrow valley. The bull snorted and pawed the muddy ground, but it no longer seemed focused on charging. "Easy, old one," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "These people are under my protection now." Martha was shocked to hear him speaking English, though with an accent she couldn't quite place. She had expected him to be a Native American who might not share her language. The man slowly approached the bull, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He held out one hand, palm open, while making soft clicking sounds with his tongue. The massive animal watched him warily but didn't retreat. "You're angry because you're trapped," the man continued, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. "I understand. But these people didn't trap you. The storm and the herd did that. Let me help you find your way out." As impossible as it seemed, the buffalo appeared to be listening. Its aggressive posture gradually relaxed, and the intelligent eyes that had been filled with rage now showed something that looked almost like curiosity. The man gestured toward a section of the bank that was slightly less steep than the rest. "There," he said. "That's your path to freedom." The bull looked where he pointed, then back at the man. For a long moment, they seemed to be having some kind of conversation that Martha couldn't understand. Then, with a final snort that sounded more like acknowledgement than threat, the great animal turned and began working its way toward the spot the man had indicated. Other buffalo in the creek followed the bull's lead, and suddenly the bottleneck began to clear. Animals that had been trapped and panicking found their way up the muddy banks and rejoined the flowing river of the herd above. The man turned his attention to Martha and Tommy, his pale blue eyes taking in their frightened faces and bedraggled appearance. Despite everything they had been through, Martha felt suddenly self-conscious about how she must look, covered in mud, her hair hanging in wet tangles, her dress torn and stained. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now but still carrying that strange accent. "My son," Martha managed to say, her own voice hoarse from fear. "His arm is bleeding." The man waded through the water toward them, moving carefully to avoid spooking Bessie any further. As he got closer, Martha could see that his unusual features came from mixed Native American and Irish heritage. His skin was the deep bronze of someone with Indian blood, but his eyes were the pale blue of the Irish hills. "Let me see," he said, kneeling beside Tommy in the shallow water. Tommy looked up at this strange man with wide eyes but didn't pull away as gentle hands examined his injured arm. The cut wasn't deep, more of a scrape really, but it was bleeding steadily. "Brave boy," the man said, giving Tommy a slight smile. "Buffalo can be scary, but this one barely touched you. You'll have a good story to tell someday." He tore a piece of clean cloth from somewhere inside his shirt and wrapped it carefully around Tommy's arm. His hands were skilled and sure, suggesting he had dealt with injuries before. "What's your name, young warrior?" he asked Tommy. "Tommy Henderson," the boy replied, his voice small but steady. "That's my mama, Martha." The man looked up at Martha, those startling blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I'm called Jake Wolf Runner," he said, "though most folks around here just call me Wolf." Martha felt a flush of heat despite the cold rain. There was something about this man's direct gaze that made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her fears and pretenses to the desperate woman beneath. "Thank you," she managed to say. "I thought we were going to die." "The day's not over yet," Wolf replied, standing and looking up at the continuing stampede above them. "This herd will take another hour to pass, maybe more, and this storm is getting worse." As if to emphasize his point, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the entire valley, followed immediately by a crack of thunder that made everyone, including the buffalo, flinch. "We need to get to shelter," Wolf continued. "There's a cave about a quarter-mile downstream, but we'll have to wait for a break in the herd to move." Martha looked around at the muddy creek bottom, then up at the thousands of buffalo still flowing overhead. How do you know when there'll be a break? Wolf's weathered face cracked into what might have been a smile. I've been following this herd for 3 days. There's a gap coming. A place where the young ones fell behind the main group. When that passes over us, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before the stragglers catch up. 3 days? Martha stared at him. Why have you been following them? Buffalo are my life, Wolf replied simply. I hunt them, but I also protect them from hunters who would slaughter them just for their hides. These animals have been on this land longer than any of us. They deserve respect. The way he spoke about the buffalo, with a mixture of reverence and understanding, told Martha that this man was unlike anyone she had ever met. He lived in a world she couldn't even imagine, where survival depended on reading the signs in nature and understanding the minds of wild animals. Another lightning flash revealed that the flow of buffalo above them was indeed beginning to thin. Instead of a solid wall of animals, Martha could now see gaps between groups. Almost time, Wolf said, moving to help her with Bessie. When I say run, we go fast and we don't look back. The cave isn't far, but we'll be in the open for a few minutes. Martha's heart began racing again. Just when she thought they might be safe, they were going to have to risk everything on another desperate dash for survival. But looking at Wolf's calm confidence, she found herself believing that he could get them through this nightmare. The sound of hooves overhead began to fade slightly. Wolf tensed, his head tilted as he listened to something Martha couldn't hear. Now, he said quietly, follow me, stay close, and trust the horse to find her footing. Without waiting for a reply, he began leading them up the muddy bank toward whatever sanctuary awaited them in the storm-lashed wilderness. Wolf moved up the muddy bank with the fluid grace of a mountain cat, somehow finding solid footing where Martha could see only slippery clay and loose stones. She followed as closely as she could, one hand gripping Tommy's small fingers and the other clutching Bessie's lead rope. The old mare struggled behind them, her hooves slipping on the treacherous slope, but Wolf's presence seemed to calm her just as it had the buffalo. They emerged from the creek valley into a world transformed by the storm. The prairie grass lay flattened by thousands of hooves in the driving rain. Deep ruts and churned mud marked where the great herd had passed. Lightning continued to flash across the darkening sky, and the thunder was now a constant rolling rumble that seemed to shake the very earth. Wolf paused at the top of the bank, his keen eyes scanning the landscape. In the distance, Martha could see the stragglers he had mentioned, small groups of buffalo moving more slowly than the main herd, some of them limping or favoring injuries received in the chaotic stampede. There, Wolf pointed to what looked like a low hill about a quarter-mile away. The cave is in those rocks. We have maybe 8 minutes before the next wave reaches us. He set off across the muddy prairie at a pace that was faster than a walk but not quite a run. Martha struggled to keep up, her wet dress wrapping around her legs with every step. Tommy ran beside her, his small legs pumping hard to match the adult's longer strides. Despite his injured arm, he didn't complain. The ground was treacherous, torn up by the passage of thousands of animals and made slippery by the rain. More than once, Martha felt her feet sliding in the mud, but each time Wolf was there to steady her with a strong hand. He seemed to anticipate every stumble, every moment when she might fall. Behind them, Bessie struggled through the mud, her breathing labored but her spirit determined. The old horse had carried them faithfully for hundreds of miles, and she wasn't giving up now. Even in the face of exhaustion and terror, as they ran, Wolf kept his eyes constantly moving, watching the horizon for signs of more buffalo, checking the storm clouds for dangerous shifts in the wind, reading the land like other men might read a book. This was clearly a man who had survived in the wilderness by understanding every nuance of the natural world around him. Who taught you to do this? Martha gasped as they hurried across a particularly rough patch of ground. Do what? Wolf replied, his breathing steady despite their pace. Live like this. Know what the animals are thinking. Survive in places where other people would die. Wolf was quiet for a moment, his eyes focused on the rocky outcrop ahead. My mother was Lakota, he said finally. She taught me to listen to the land. My father was an Irish trapper who taught me to survive among white men. Both worlds have their wisdom. Martha understood now why he seemed so comfortable in this wild place. He was a man who belonged to both worlds and neither, forced to make his own path in a land where mixed heritage often meant acceptance nowhere. They were halfway to the rocks when Martha heard a sound that made her blood run cold. It was the rumble of approaching hooves again, But this time it came from a different direction. She looked over her shoulder and saw a group of about 50 buffalo emerging from a gully to their left. These weren't part of the main herd. They were a separate group that had been grazing in a hidden valley and was now trying to catch up with the stampede. "Wolf," she called. But he had already seen them. His jaw tightened as he calculated distances and timing. The cave was still 100 yards away, but the buffalo were moving fast and would intersect their path in less than 2 minutes. "Can we reach the rocks in time?" Martha asked. Wolf shook his head grimly. "Not with the horse. Bessie's too tired to run that fast." For a moment, Martha thought he was going to suggest they abandon the mare and run for their lives. Instead, he did something that surprised her completely. He stopped running and began untying something from his belt. It was a horn of some kind, carved from what looked like buffalo horn, and decorated with intricate patterns. Wolf raised it to his lips and blew a long, haunting note that seemed to echo across the prairie despite the storm. The approaching buffalo slowed at the sound, their heads coming up as they tried to identify this strange call. Wolf blew the horn again, this time a different sequence of notes that rose and fell like a song. "What are you doing?" Martha asked, amazed. "Talking to them," Wolf replied, then blew another series of notes. The buffalo had stopped completely now, about 50 yards away. They stood in a tight group, their massive heads turned toward the small party of humans. Martha could see confusion in their dark eyes, as if they were trying to remember something important. Wolf lowered the horn and began making a series of clicking and huffing sounds with his mouth, sounds that were eerily similar to the calls buffalo made to each other. The lead cow of the group, a grizzled old female with scars on her flanks, took a few steps forward and answered with her own low grunt. What followed was perhaps the strangest conversation Martha had ever witnessed. Wolf and the buffalo cow seemed to be communicating in a language of sounds and gestures that went far beyond anything she thought possible between human and animal. The other buffalo watched and listened, occasionally adding their own comments to the discussion. Finally, the old cow turned away and began leading her group in a wide circle around the humans. They passed within 20 yards of where Martha stood, close enough that she could see the individual hairs in their shaggy coats and smell the wild scent of their bodies, but not one of them showed any aggression or fear. "How did you do that?" Martha whispered as the last buffalo disappeared into the storm. "I told her we were seeking shelter from the storm, just like her people," Wolf replied, putting the horn back on his belt. "I promised we meant no harm to her or her young ones. She chose to believe me." They resumed their journey toward the cave, but at a more leisurely pace now that the immediate danger had passed. Martha's mind was reeling from what she had just witnessed. She had always thought of buffalo as mindless beasts, dangerous but without intelligence. Wolf had shown her that they were something far more complex. The cave turned out to be larger than Martha had expected, carved into a sandstone outcrop that rose from the prairie like a small mountain. The opening was wide enough for Bessie to enter, and the interior extended back into darkness beyond the reach of the storm. Wolf had clearly used this shelter before. Near the entrance, Martha could see the remains of old campfires and a neat stack of dry wood protected from the weather. Crude shelves carved into the rock walls held supplies, dried meat, tools, extra clothing, and other necessities for survival in the wilderness. "Welcome to my home away from home," Wolf said with what might have been humor. "It's not much, but it's dry and safe." As they settled inside the cave, Wolf quickly built a fire using tinder from his supplies and techniques Martha had never seen before. Soon, warm light was dancing on the cave walls, and the welcome heat began drying their soaked clothing. Tommy fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the day's terrors and adventures. Martha wrapped him in a dry blanket, Wolf provided, and watched his peaceful face in the firelight. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, she had thought they were all going to die. "Why did you help us?" Martha asked as Wolf tended to Bessie, checking her hooves for stones and rubbing down her tired muscles. Wolf was quiet for a long moment, his hands working with practiced skill on the horse. "I've seen too many good people die in this country for no reason," he said finally. "Maybe I can't save everyone, but I could save you. But you don't even know us. We're strangers." "So was I once," Wolf replied. "Someone helped me when I had nowhere else to turn. A Lakota chief named Standing Bear found me when I was about Tommy's age, half dead from cold and hunger. My Irish father had died of fever, and my mother's people weren't sure what to do with a half-breed boy who didn't fit anywhere." He moved to the fire and added another piece of wood, the flames casting shifting shadows on his weathered face. Standing Bear could have left me to die. Instead, he taught me the old ways: how to read the signs in nature, how to speak with the animals, how to survive when survival seems impossible. He said the spirits had sent me a message through my mixed blood, that I was meant to be a bridge between worlds. Martha watched him in the firelight and began to understand the loneliness this man must have lived with his entire life. Too Native American to be fully accepted in white society, too white to be completely accepted by the tribes. He had made his own place in the wilderness, creating a life that depended on his unique skills and knowledge. "Where do you live?" she asked. "Wherever I need to be," Wolf replied. "I have camps like this scattered across the territory. I follow the herds, guide travelers who get lost, sometimes scout for the army when they need someone who knows the land. It's not an easy life, but it's mine." Outside the cave, the storm was beginning to weaken. The thunder had moved off to the east, and the rain had settled into a steady drizzle. In the distance, Martha could still hear the occasional low call of buffalo, but the great stampede had passed. "What will happen to us now?" Martha asked. The question that had been haunting her for months was even more pressing now. Their wagon was somewhere back in the creek valley, probably damaged. Their supplies were scattered or ruined, and they were still hundreds of miles from the Montana territory where her brother-in-law waited. "That depends on what you want," Wolf said. "I could guide you to the nearest town. Millerville is about 40 miles north of here. There are people there who might help a widow with a child. Or what?" Wolf looked at her directly, his pale blue eyes serious in the firelight. "Or you could come with me. I'm heading into the Montana territory myself. I know the safe routes, the places to find water and shelter. It would be a hard journey, but I could get you there alive." Martha's heart began racing at the suggestion, though she wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else entirely. The idea of traveling through the wilderness with this strange man should have terrified her. Instead, she found herself seriously considering it. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Wolf was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had heard it before. "Because in all my years of wandering, I've never met anyone who faced down a buffalo stampede and worried more about her child's scraped arm than her own survival," he said. "That kind of courage deserves to reach its destination." Martha felt tears starting to form in her eyes, the first tears she had allowed herself since James died. For months, she had been holding everything together through sheer determination, afraid that if she showed any weakness, she and Tommy would be lost. But sitting here in the warm cave, with the storm passing overhead and Tommy safe beside her, she finally felt like she could let her guard down. "I don't know anything about living in the wilderness," she said. "I could teach you," Wolf replied. "The same way Standing Bear taught me. You've already shown you have the courage for it." As dawn approached and the storm finally cleared, Martha looked out of the cave at the vast prairie stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there lay the future she had been traveling toward, a new life in the Montana territory. But now she had to choose how she would reach that future. She could take the safe path to Millerville and hope for the kindness of strangers, or she could trust this mysterious man who spoke the language of wild animals and seemed to belong more to the wind and sky than to any human settlement. Looking at Wolf's weathered face in the morning light, and remembering how he had stood fearlessly between her family and a charging buffalo, Martha realized her choice had already been made. Sometimes salvation came in the form you least expected, not as a rescue from the wilderness, but as a guide who could teach you to make the wilderness your home.